This is Stone Soup Requiem, written by Marius Myberg, using the Ghostwriter system. Audio narration is also by the Ghostwriter system. Make your stories come alive. Join at ghostwrite.inc. Now, enjoy Stone Soup Requiem. Chapter 1. The Weight of Dust. The scrape of Jean-Luc's boots against the pre-dawn sidewalk was the only sound he registered. He hadn't slept. Sleep had become a luxury he could no longer afford. Each brick, each crack in the pavement was a familiar landmark in his meticulously ordered world. He was a ghost haunting his own life, moving through the city's underbelly while others slept, scrubbing away the evidence of their living. The sky was a bruised purple, bleeding into a cold steel gray as he approached the sanitation depot. The air hung thick with the smell of diesel and stale refuse, a perfume he'd grown accustomed to. The depot loomed, a concrete behemoth humming with the promise of another day's labor. He clocked in, the punch of the time card a hollow echo in the cavernous garage. His route was always the same: the forgotten alleys behind the restaurants, the overflowing bins of the market, the detritus of lives lived and discarded. He worked with a grim efficiency, his movements precise and economical. The weight of the trash bags, the sting of the disinfectant, were a penance he seemed determined to endure. Later, the fluorescent lights of the depot's multi-purpose room buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pallor on the small group gathered for their mandatory therapy session. The chairs, hard plastic and unforgiving, were arranged in a circle. Myrail, their therapist, sat opposite him, her face etched with a weary cynicism that mirrored his own. Solange, a woman whose age was a tightly guarded secret, clutched her worn handbag as if it contained the last vestiges of her dignity. Bastien, the youngest of the group, fidgeted, his restless energy barely contained. Jean-Luc avoided eye contact, focusing on the minute details of the room, the water stains on the ceiling tiles, the faded motivational posters tacked to the wall. Myrail sighed, the sound barely audible above the hum of the lights. "All right, let's begin," she said, her voice flat. "How are we all feeling today?" Bastien snorted. "How do you think, lady? Stuck in this shithole when I could be out doing something worthwhile." Myrail didn't react. "And you, Solange?" The old woman glared at Bastien. "I am feeling as well as can be expected, considering the company I am forced to keep." Myrail turned her gaze to Jean-Luc. "Jean-Luc." He met her eyes briefly, then looked away. "The same," he said, his voice a low murmur. "The same," Myrail echoed, her tone suggesting she expected nothing less. "And what does the same entail, Jean-Luc?" He hesitated, his fingers twitching. "Work, eat, sleep, repeat." "A fulfilling existence," Myrail said, her lips curling into a sardonic smile. She clicked the end of her pen, a nervous habit he'd noticed before. "Anyone have any breakthroughs to share?" Silence descended, thick and heavy. Jean-Luc could feel the weight of unspoken grief in the room, the shared burden of lives lived in the shadows. He stared at his calloused hands, the lines etched deep into his skin, each one a reminder of what he'd lost. Bastien cracked his knuckles, the sound sharp in the stillness. "I almost didn't punch a guy at the bar last night," he offered, his tone defiant. "That's progress, right?" Myrail nodded, her expression unchanged. "Indeed, Bastien, progress." Solange sniffed. "Progress would be if you learned to control your temper altogether, young man." "Yeah, well, progress takes time, lady," Bastien retorted. "Unlike you, I ain't got all day." Myrail held up a hand, forestalling further argument. All right. Let's try a different approach. Anyone have anything interesting happen this week?"
"Anything at all?" Jean-Luc thought of the recurring nightmare that haunted his sleep, the image of twisted metal and shattered glass. He thought of the silence of his apartment, the dust motes dancing in the pale sunlight. He thought of the weight of the coin in his pocket, a constant reminder of a life he could never reclaim. But he said nothing. Solange sighed dramatically. "My neighbor's cat relieved itself on my doorstep again. Does that qualify as interesting?" Mireille massaged her temples. "Anything deeper? Something that touched you emotionally?" Bastien laughed. "The price of beer going up touched me emotionally." Mireille closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering her strength. "All right," she said, her voice weary. "We'll try again next week. same time, same place. Try to reflect on yourselves, on your lives, on something. She stood up, signaling the end of the session. Dismissed. Jean-Luc rose, the scrape of his chair echoing in the room. He avoided eye contact as he made his way to the door, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the therapy room. He punched out, the cold air of the depot a welcome relief. He walked out into the city, the weight of the day settling upon him like a shroud. The world outside continued. His did not. He walked for a while, the city slowly waking around him. Delivery trucks rumbled, their engines echoing between the buildings. Shopkeepers hosed down sidewalks, chasing away the grime of the night. The scent of freshly baked bread wafted from a boulangerie, a temporary distraction from the ever-present smell of refuse. He resisted the urge to stop, to buy a croissant, to participate in the normalcy he craved, but could never truly grasp again. Instead, he continued toward the park, a small patch of green amidst the concrete jungle. It was there, on a specific bench overlooking a small pond, that he ate his meager lunch, a stale baguette and a bruised apple, procured from a discarded bag he'd salvaged that morning. He watched the ducks glide across the water, their effortless movement a stark contrast to the leaden feeling in his limbs. A young mother pushed a stroller past, her face radiant as she cooed at her baby. He averted his gaze, the sight too painful to bear. As he finished his lunch, he noticed a figure approaching. It was Mireille, his therapist. She walked with the same weary slump he'd observed in the therapy room, her shoulders stooped as if carrying an invisible weight. She stopped a few feet away, her expression unreadable. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice softer than it had been earlier. He shrugged, gesturing to the empty space beside him. She sat, maintaining a careful distance. "Beautiful day," she said, her gaze fixed on the ducks. He grunted non-committally. A silence stretched between them, broken only by the gentle lapping of the water. Finally, Mireille spoke again. "You know," she said, "I get it. The resistance, the unwillingness to engage." He remained silent, his eyes fixed on his hands. "It's hard," she continued, "to open yourself up when you feel like there's nothing left inside, like you've already given everything you have to give." He flinched, her words hitting closer to home than he'd expected. He wanted to tell her to stop, to go away, but the words wouldn't come. "But it's still worth trying," she said, turning to face him. Her eyes, though tired, held a flicker of something. Compassion, perhaps. "Even if it's just a tiny spark, a glimmer of hope, it's worth fighting for." He finally met her gaze, his eyes filled with a pain so profound it seemed to radiate outwards. "What's the point?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What's the point of fighting when you know you've already lost?" Mireille looked at him for a long moment, her expression a mixture of sadness and understanding. "Maybe," she said softly, "the point isn't about winning. Maybe it's just about surviving."
About finding a way to keep breathing, even when it feels like you're drowning. He turned further away, the air catching in his throat. Chapter 2. A Tired Recipe. Mireille pushed the wheeled cart across the therapy room floor, the squeak of its casters a shrill counterpoint to the low hum of the fluorescent lights. On the cart sat a mixing bowl, scarred and stained, and a stack of chipped mugs that looked as if they'd survived a minor war. "Right then," she said, her voice flat. "Stone soup." Bastien snorted, the sound echoing in the sterile space. Solange's lips tightened into a thin, disapproving line. Jean-Luc watched Mireille, his gaze steady but unreadable. He ran a thumb along the worn handle of his pocket knife, but didn't remove it from his pocket. Mireille sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades of disillusionment. "It's an exercise," she clarified, though no one had asked. "A collaborative thing." She set the bowl down with a thump. "The idea is we each contribute something. Like the folktale. Stone soup?" She raised an eyebrow, daring someone to admit they hadn't heard of it. Bastien shifted in his seat. "Sounds fucking stupid." "The point," Mireille continued, her voice rising slightly, "is to create something together from seemingly nothing. A metaphor," she added, as if speaking to a particularly slow child. "For Teamwork. She trailed off, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. Solange sniffed. Teamwork. In this place? Preposterous. She adjusted her handbag on her lap, her knuckles white. We are all broken toys, Madame Muret, best left in our separate boxes. Muret ignored her. Next session, she said, turning her gaze to each of them in turn. Bring something. Anything. Small. Meaningful. An object. A touchstone. She shuddered inwardly at the word, disgusted by its earnestness. Jean-Luc's eyes flickered to his calloused hands, then back to Muret. He hadn't held anything meaningful in years. Everything he touched turned to ash. Or worse. And what, Bastien asked, his voice laced with sarcasm, if we don't want to bring something? Hey, you gonna make us? He cracked his knuckles, the sound sharp and aggressive. Muret leveled a weary look at him. It's mandatory, Bastien. Like these sessions themselves. So yes, in a way, I am. He scowled, but didn't push it. Muret knew he wouldn't. Not really. His anger was mostly bluster, a thin shield against a world that terrified him. Solange spoke again, her voice laced with acid. Meaningful. What could possibly be meaningful in this charade? My life is a catalogue of betrayals and disappointments. Should I bring a list? Bring whatever you like, Solange, Muret said, her voice devoid of inflection. Or don't. It makes little difference to me. She glanced at Jean-Luc. He hadn't spoken, but she saw something in his eyes, a flicker of something that might have been curiosity, or perhaps just a morbid fascination. It was more reaction than she'd gotten from him in weeks. The session dissolved into its usual strained silence, punctuated by Bastien's fidgeting and Solange's muttered complaints. Mireille leaned back in her chair, clicking the end of her pen, the sound a metronome counting down the minutes until she could escape this room and its inhabitants. Later, Jean-Luc sat on the edge of this threadbare couch, the silence of his apartment pressing in on him. The chipped formica tabletop gleamed under the harsh light of a single overhead bulb. He methodically cleaned his fingernails with his pocket knife, the scraping sound oddly loud in the stillness. Meaningful. What a joke. His life was defined by loss, by the gaping hole where his family used to be. What object could possibly represent that? The twisted wreckage of the car, a photograph burned at the edges. He closed the knife and slipped it back into his pocket. He walked to the window and stared out at the bleak cityscape. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the promise of more snow. The city lights blurred into indistinct pools of yellow. Meaningful. It was all meaningless.
The work, the therapy, the empty apartment. All meaningless. His gaze drifted to a small, tarnished coin that sat on his desk, nestled among the meticulously arranged tools and supplies he no longer used. It was a relic from another time, another life, a life where things had meaning, a life before. He picked up the coin, its weight familiar in his palm. It was worn smooth with age and handling, the details of its design almost completely erased. He turned it over and over in his fingers, the metal cold against his skin. Could this be it? Could this small, insignificant object somehow represent the enormity of his loss? He wasn't sure. But as he looked at it, a faint, almost forgotten memory surfaced, a flash of laughter, a warm embrace, a feeling of belonging. He quickly shoved it back onto the desk, as if burned. He turned away from the window, from the coin, from the ghost of a life he could never reclaim. Meaningful, he thought again, the word now laced with a bitter irony. It was a cruel joke, a mockery of his pain. But still, the seed had been planted. A tiny seed of something. He wasn't sure what, but it was there, buried deep beneath the layers of grief and despair. Back in her office, Mireille stared at the notes from the session. Stone soup, she'd written, then underlined it with a heavy hand. She knew it was a cliché, a tired exercise that rarely yielded any real results, but she was out of ideas, and frankly, she didn't care enough to try anymore. The municipal system had squeezed the life out of her, leaving her a hollow shell, dispensing platitudes to people who were beyond help. She swiveled in her chair and looked out the window. The snow had started to fall, fat, wet flakes that plastered themselves against the glass. Another storm, another day of canceled appointments, of empty offices, of enforced isolation. She sighed and reached for her coffee, the lukewarm liquid a poor substitute for the warmth she craved. Maybe, just maybe, this ridiculous exercise would be enough to fill the time and keep them from each other's throats. She really just needed them to leave her alone.
Chapter 3. The Tarnished Offering. The chairs scraped against the linoleum as the group settled in, the fluorescent lights of the therapy room humming their familiar, monotonous tune. Mireille, perched on the edge of her seat, pen clicking with a nervous energy she tried to mask with professional detachment, began. "So, shall we see what treasures we've unearthed for our soup?" Bastien was first. He tossed a crumpled pack of cigarettes onto the table, the cellophane crinkling. "My old man's. Gave 'em up. Figure they're poison anyway." There was a defiance in his tone, a challenge in his eyes, daring anyone to question his offering. Mireille nodded, making a note on her pad. "Thank you, Bastien." Solange followed, her movements slow and deliberate. She opened her worn handbag and extracted a small, smooth stone, placing it carefully on the table. "Found it on the beach years ago. Reminds me of nothing, which is a blessing." Her voice was flat, devoid of inflection, but Jean-Luc noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she returned them to her lap. Next was Mireille, with a sigh. She removed her pen from her hand, setting it by Solange's stone. A constant companion, and a constant source of frustration. All eyes turned to Jean-Luc. He sat silently, his hands clasped in his lap, his gaze fixed on the worn surface of the table. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the hum of the lights and the distant rumble of a truck outside. Mireille cleared her throat, about to prompt him when he finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against the cool metal, tracing its worn edges. He pulled out the coin, the tarnished metal catching the light. It was heavier than it looked, a solid weight in his palm. He placed it on the table, the dull thud echoing in the stillness. It wasn't much to look at, a small disc of metal, dark with age and wear. The markings were almost illegible, the image of a long-forgotten ruler barely visible. It was a coin from a country that no longer existed, a relic of a past that had vanished. The moment it touched the surface, the atmosphere shifted. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the silence taking on a new, oppressive quality. It was as if the coin had released something, a tremor of something old and forgotten. Solange gasped, a sharp, strangled sound. Her eyes widened, her face paling beneath its network of wrinkles. Her hand flew to her chest, clutching at her blouse as if she were in pain. "What is it, Solange?" Mireille asked, her voice sharp with concern. Bastien, too, stared at the elderly woman, his usual bravado replaced with a flicker of unease. Solange didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on the coin, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and recognition. Her body began to tremble, the tremor escalating into a violent shudder that shook her frail frame. That, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. She reached out a trembling hand towards the coin, then snatched it back as if burned. "Solange, are you all right?" Mireille repeated, rising from her chair. She moved towards the elderly woman, her hand outstretched. "Get it away!" Solange cried, her voice rising in panic. "Get it away from me!" She recoiled, pressing herself back against her chair as far as she could go. Jean-Luc watched, his face impassive, his eyes unreadable. He had expected something. He hadn't known what. He hadn't anticipated this. Mireille glanced at Jean-Luc, a question in her eyes. He simply shrugged, his expression unchanging. She turned back to Solange, her voice calm and soothing. "Solange, it's all right. It's just a coin. Nothing to be afraid of." She spoke as if to a frightened child, her professional mask firmly in place, though Jean-Luc caught a glimpse of something else in her eyes, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even a hint of excitement. "No, you don't understand," Solange wailed, her voice cracking. "It's not just a coin." It's... She trailed off, her words lost in a sob. She pressed her hands to her face, her body racked with sobs. Bastien shifted uneasily in his seat. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered, his voice laced with apprehension. "It's just a damn coin." "I think," Mireille said slowly, her gaze fixed on Solange, "that it might be a little more than that." She looked from Solange back to the coin. A tarnished piece of metal had managed to break through Solange's seemingly impenetrable shell. Jean-Luc's contribution was far more valuable than she could have hoped. "Maybe this is enough for today." Jean-Luc's voice was raspy, unpracticed.
the first time he had spoken more than a couple words in weeks. "If she isn't well," he nodded to Solange. Mireille raised an eyebrow but didn't push it. "Yes, perhaps you're right." The hum of the light seemed to intensify, the air growing heavy with unspoken tension. The tarnished coin lay on the table, a silent witness to the unraveling that had just begun. It had unlocked something, a Pandora's box of repressed memories and buried pain. And Jean-Luc, the man who had offered it, watched with a quiet, unsettling intensity, the faintest flicker of something akin to hope? Outside, the wind howled, a premonition of the storm to come. It scratched at the windows of the depot, and the light overhead began to flicker ominously, as though affected by the dark forces within the room itself. The snow had started, and the city was about to be shut down, trapping the group in their shared space, with nowhere to go but deeper inside. Bastien, despite his earlier bravado, edged his chair back slightly from the table, his eyes darting between Solange and the offending coin. "Maybe we should just, put it away," he mumbled, his voice lacking its usual edge. "Until later." Mireille, though visibly intrigued, prioritized her patient's well-being. She knelt beside Solange, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Solange, can you tell me what's wrong? What does the coin make you feel?" Solange, still trembling, shook her head violently, her eyes squeezed shut. No, I can't. Don't make me. It's been buried for so long." Jean-Luc watched the interaction, a knot forming in his stomach. He hadn't intended to cause so much distress, but a small part of him, a dark, buried part, felt a grim satisfaction at having elicited such a strong reaction. He knew the coin held power, a power born of suffering and loss. The flickering light above cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. The wind howled louder now, rattling the windows, a constant, mournful cry. The snow intensified outside, blanketing the world in a thick, white shroud. Mireille glanced at Jean-Luc again, her expression now a mixture of concern and something else, a desperate plea for understanding. He remained silent, his face a mask of stoicism. He wouldn't explain. He couldn't. Finally, Solange managed to choke out a few words, her voice raspy and strained. "It reminds me of the well?" "The well?" Mireille repeated gently, encouraging her to continue. Solange nodded, her eyes still tightly closed. "The well in the village, where they—" She trailed off, her voice cracking with emotion. She clutched Mireille's hand with surprising strength, her knuckles white. The tarnished coin continued to radiate an almost palpable energy. Jean-Luc, despite his impassivity, felt a pang of guilt, warring with that darker satisfaction. He broke his silence. "Maybe we stop?" It was difficult for him to form the words, but he tried. Enough for now. His eyes, though, remained fixed on Solange.
Chapter 4. Fractures. The silence following Solange's outburst was thick, a suffocating blanket woven from shock and unspoken dread. Jean-Luc, who had broken weeks of muteness, retreated back into himself, his gaze fixed on the tarnished coin as if it held an answer to a question he dared not ask. Mireille, her professional composure shattered, fiddled with the pen in her hand, the clicking of frantic counterpoint to the oppressive quiet. It was Solange who broke the silence, her voice raspy and strained. "It was 1948, she began, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "I was working in the factory, just outside Lyon, making munitions." She paused, the word hanging in the air like a foul odor. "Everyone was desperate for work, desperate for anything." She clutched her worn handbag tighter, her knuckles bone white. "They promised us good wages, a place to live, safety." Her voice cracked. "Lies, all lies." "The owner," she shuddered, unable to meet anyone's gaze. "He paid us with those coins, said they were good as francs, worth more even. But the shopkeepers, they wouldn't take them, said they were worthless, counterfeit." Bastien shifted in his seat, his usual swagger gone, replaced by a raw unease. "So what? You got screwed over by some dodgy boss. Happens all the time." Solange's head snapped up, her eyes blazing with a sudden fury. "It wasn't just the money, you fool. It was the betrayal. We were starving. My family, they were depending on me. And he knew it. He knew what he was doing.
He was profiting from our misery. And that coin, that damn coin, it reminds me of it all. Of the hunger, the shame, the powerlessness. Jean-Luc flinched, the memory of his own powerlessness washing over him, a familiar, bitter tide. The factory, the snow falling outside, it all merged with his own tragic past. Mireille watched, a detached observer despite herself. Solange's carefully constructed facade of resentment had crumbled, revealing the raw, festering wound beneath. It was precisely this kind of uncontrolled vulnerability that Mireille usually avoided. The neat lines of therapy, the carefully worded questions, the measured responses, all useless now. "Okay, Solange," Mireille said, her voice regaining some of its professional edge. "Thank you for sharing. That was difficult. Perhaps we should—" Bastien cut her off, a harsh laugh escaping his lips. "Difficult? You think that's difficult? Try living with this, lady." He shoved up the sleeve of his worn jacket, revealing a crude, self-inflicted tattoo on his forearm, a coiled snake with blood-red eyes. "Got this when I was 15, after I put my stepfather in the hospital." The room went silent again, the only sound the hum of the dying fluorescent lights. Bastien's confession hung in the air, heavy and menacing. He deserved it," Bastien continued, his voice barely a whisper. He was hurting my mother and my little sister. I told him to stop. I begged him, but he wouldn't listen. So I took a baseball bat." He stopped, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Don't give me that look," he snarled at Mireille. "He deserved it, every last bit of it." "Bastien," Mireille began, but he waved her off. "No, you wanted us to share. Fine, there's my story. Now what? You gonna call the cops? Gonna tell me I need more therapy? I don't need your bullshit. I did what I had to do to protect my family." Jean-Luc stared at Bastien, a flicker of something, understanding perhaps, in his tired eyes. He too had done what he thought he had to do, and the consequences, they had shaped his entire existence. The lights flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The snow was coming down harder now, a swirling white curtain that cut them off from the world.
Solange, still trembling, reached out and took Jean-Luc's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "We did what we had to do," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "We survived." Mireille watched them, the fragile connection between the two broken souls sending a shiver down her spine. Her carefully constructed world, her cynical detachment, it was all crumbling around her. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm brewing within the therapy room. She was losing control, and she wasn't sure she wanted it back. The air grew colder as the lights finally gave out completely, plunging them into near darkness. A primal fear, sharper and more urgent than anything Mireille had felt in years, pierced through her weary cynicism. The world outside, and quite possibly the world inside the room, was now governed by brutal necessity. "We need to find a way to get help," she said, her voice sounding weak and uncertain even to her own ears, "before it's too late." The darkness pressed in, amplifying the howling wind. Mireille fumbled for her phone, its screen illuminating her face with an anemic glow. No signal, of course. She tried Jean-Luc. Nothing. Bastien. Still nothing. Trapped. "Great," Bastien muttered, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "Just fucking great." He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'm going to check the generator." He moved with a surprising agility, disappearing into the inky blackness beyond the door. "Be careful," Mireille called after him, though she doubted he heard her. Solange squeezed Jean-Luc's hand tighter. "The darkness, it brings back memories." She was breathing rapidly, her chest heaving. Jean-Luc, for the first time since the session had begun, spoke clearly. "What factory was it, Solange? What was its name?" Solange hesitated. I don't remember." But her eyes betrayed her. "Think," Jean-Luc pressed, his voice surprisingly firm. "It's important." Mireille watched, fascinated. Jean-Luc, usually so withdrawn, seemed to have found a new strength, fueled by Solange's distress. Solange closed her eyes, her brow furrowed in concentration. Armand Frères, that was the name. Armand Frères Munitions. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her wrinkled cheek. "They used us.
chewed us up and spat us out. Jean-Luc's face paled visibly, his breath caught in his throat. Armand, that name, he whispered, then clutched his head. The coin fell from his limp hand, clattering on the floor, swallowed by the darkness. Mireille, alarmed, reached out to steady him. Jean-Luc, are you all right? He shook his head, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. Armand Frères, that was my family's factory. He looked at Solange, his gaze filled with a mixture of anguish and disbelief. My grandfather owned it. He began to hyperventilate, the weight of generations crashing down upon him. The coin was his family's cursed inheritance. He now knew it, and knew too the terrible price that came with it. Bastien returned, his silhouette framed in the doorway, his face grim. Generator's dead. Looks like we're stuck here for the night. He paused, noticing Jean-Luc's distress. What the hell's going on? The room felt colder now, the darkness heavier. The storm raged outside, a fitting soundtrack to the unfolding tragedy within. Mireille, no longer a detached observer, felt a surge of panic. This was no longer a therapy session. It was a disaster. Bastien stepped further into the room, pulling a battered Cibot lighter from his pocket. The small flame illuminated his face, highlighting the worry etched into his features. Hey, old man, breathe. Just breathe. We'll figure this out. He looked from Jean-Luc to Solange, a flicker of understanding dawning in his eyes. Armand Frères. That was a munitions factory, right? Back in the day. He shook his head, the lighter flame dancing in his hand. Small world,
Chapter 5. The Observer. Mireille watched Bastien carefully, the tremor in her hands betraying a fear she hadn't felt so acutely in years. The boy radiated a contained chaos, and the story he'd just told, about protecting his mother and sister, vibrated in the stale air of the therapy room. Her therapy room. It suddenly felt less like a space of controlled interaction, and more like a pressure cooker with a faulty valve. The image was apt, and she hated herself for thinking it, for the clinical detachment that still clung to her like cheap perfume. "Thank you for sharing, Bastien," she managed, her voice sounding thin even to her own ears. "That takes courage." He shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "Whatever, it is what it is." He cracked his knuckles, the sound amplified in the sudden quiet left by the power outage. A fresh wave of cold air snaked in through the ill-fitting window frame, and she could hear the wind howling outside, a hungry, insistent sound. Solange remained silent, hunched in on herself like a wounded bird. The revelations about the coin, about its history of exploitation, had taken a visible toll. Mireille resisted the urge to reach out, to offer some empty platitude of comfort. She knew, with a certainty that settled heavy in her gut, that words were useless here. Perhaps they always had been. Jean-Luc, his face obscured by shadow, had said nothing since the lights went out. But she had seen the flicker of something in his eyes when Bastien spoke, a brief, shared understanding. It was a connection, however tenuous, in this maelstrom of fear and regret. The darkness amplified the sounds of the storm. The wind clawed at the building, and the snow beat against the windows like desperate hands. Mireille pushed herself up from the chair, the legs scraping against the linoleum. "We need to find help," she said, stating the obvious. "Someone needs to know we're here." She fumbled for her phone, the screen offering a weak, inadequate light. No signal, of course. She clicked the end of her pen, the sound sharp and brittle in the dark. Jean-Luc shifted beside her. "Le depot," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Someone will be there." Mireille considered this, her mind racing. The depot was a maze of corridors and locked doors, even during daylight hours. Navigating it in this storm, in the dark, was a risk, but staying put was a guarantee. And she felt, rather than thought, that staying here would be a mistake. Her mistake, the one she had avoided making all these years. "Okay," she said, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. "Jean-Luc, can you lead the way? Bastien, stay close. Solange?" She hesitated, unsure what to say to the fragile woman. "Can you manage?" Solange looked up, her eyes glinting in the dim light of Mireille's phone. "I have managed worse," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. Mireille thought of her own worse, the memory a dull ache behind her breastbone, her first and only child stillborn after a late-term complication, the subsequent spiral into grief, the slow, insidious erosion of her faith in everything, in medicine, in humanity, in herself. It had been easier to retreat, to build walls of cynicism and detachment, to observe from a safe distance. But that distance had become a prison, and now, trapped in the dark with these broken people, she was starting to feel the walls closing in. She glanced out the window, the glass now opaque with snow. The storm had intensified, the wind howling like a banshee. They were isolated, cut off from the world. She felt a surge of something akin to panic, quickly suppressed. Professionally, she knew what to do. Inhale, exhale, assess, plan, act. But professional detachment only took you so far. She needed to keep them calm, but she needed to be calm herself.
She needed to actually care, not just fake it for the sake of professional duty. "All right," she said, drawing a shaky breath.
Let's go. Mireille led the way, with Jean-Luc, Bastien, and Solange. She did not turn back. The therapy room was now as dark as her soul. Jean-Luc moved to the door, his large frame a reassuring presence in the gloom. He fumbled with the unfamiliar lock for a moment, the metallic clicks echoing in the stillness, before he managed to release it. He opened the door slowly, and a blast of icy air slammed into the room, carrying with it a flurry of snow. "Brace yourselves," he grunted, pulling his coat tighter around him. The hallway outside was barely visible, lit only by the pale glow filtering through the windows at either end. The power outage had plunged the entire building into darkness, and the emergency lighting system, if there was one, had clearly failed. The air was thick with the smell of dust and damp concrete, a smell Mireille associated with neglect and decay. They stepped out into the hallway, the cold immediately biting through their clothes. Bastien shivered beside her, and Mireille instinctively moved closer, shielding him with her body. Solange followed close behind, her small frame trembling. "This way," Jean-Luc said, his voice barely audible above the roar of the wind. He led them down the hallway, his hand trailing along the wall to guide him. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the rhythmic thump of their boots and the relentless assault of the storm. As they walked, Mireille's mind wandered back to the sterile safety of her training. She remembered the endless lectures, the case studies, the carefully constructed theories. None of it seemed remotely relevant now, faced with the raw, untamed force of the storm and the desperate hope in the eyes of the people she was leading. Everything she'd ever learned about managing emotions, about creating therapeutic distance, felt useless, even cruel. Suddenly, Bastien gasped, stumbling backwards into Mireille. "What is it?" she asked, her hand tightening on his shoulder. He pointed towards the end of the hallway, his eyes wide with fear. I saw something. Moving." Mireille strained her eyes, trying to pierce the darkness. She saw nothing, only the faint outline of the windows at the end of the hall, blurred by the driving snow. Jean-Luc moved forward, his imposing figure a bulwark against the unseen threat. "There's nothing there, boy," he said, his voice firm. "Just shadows playing tricks on your eyes." But Bastien remained unconvinced, his body tense and alert. Mireille couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was lurking in the darkness, waiting for them. The storm had amplified everything, not just the noise, but also the feeling of vulnerability, of being exposed. "Let's keep moving," she said, her voice tight. "The depot can't be much further." She quickened her pace, urging the others to follow. The darkness seemed to press in on them, the shadows dancing and shifting, playing tricks on their minds. She felt a sudden, overwhelming desire to turn back, to retreat to the relative safety of her therapy room. But she knew they couldn't. They had to keep going, had to find help. Their lives, perhaps, depended on it. The feeling was new and overwhelming, not clinical, personal. She looked at the faces of Jean-Luc, Bastien, and Solange. They were looking back, putting their hope in her. Mireille realized that she had to stop observing and actually step into the danger. It may be late, but the time had come to act. Mireille took a deep breath, stepping into the shadows. "We will get through this, together." "Did anyone else see that?" Bastien asked, his voice barely a whisper, turning to Jean-Luc and Mireille for reassurance or an answer. Jean-Luc scanned the darkness again, his brow furrowed. "Like I said, kid, tricks of the light. The storm's playing with your head." But even as he said it, Mireille saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a sense that he too felt something unsettling.
"Maybe," Bastien said, but he didn't sound convinced. He pulled his thin jacket tighter around himself, his gaze darting nervously from shadow to shadow. Mireille placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to offer a reassuring smile. "We're all a little on edge," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "The storm's making things difficult." She hesitated, then added, "But we're together. We'll look out for each other." Solange, who had been silent since Bastien's exclamation, suddenly spoke up. "It's the coin," she croaked, her voice raspy. "It attracts unwanted attention." She clutched her hand tighter around something in her pocket. Mireille knew it had to be the cursed coin. Mireille frowned. She didn't believe in curses, not really, but she couldn't deny the palpable sense of unease that had settled over them since the power went out, since Bastien revealed the truth about the coin. There was something in Solange's eyes, a haunted look that spoke of genuine fear. Jean-Luc sighed, his breath misting in the cold air. "Let's not get carried away with superstitions," he said, his voice weary. "We need to focus on getting to the depot." "He's right," Mireille said, forcing a note of resolve in her voice. "We can't afford to let our imaginations run wild. Stick together, stay alert, and we'll be fine." Although she said the words, she felt herself struggling to believe them. She was supposed to be a professional, but here, in this storm, in this darkness, all she felt was helpless. They continued down the hallway, the silence punctuated only by the wind and the occasional creak of the building settling. Mireille felt a growing sense of claustrophobia, as if the walls were closing in on them. She glanced over her shoulder every few seconds, half expecting to see something, some shadowy figure lurking in the darkness. As they reached the end of the hallway, Jean-Luc stopped, his hand raised in warning. "Wait," he whispered. "I hear something." Mireille strained her ears, listening intently. At first, she heard only the wind, but then she heard it too, a faint scratching sound, coming from somewhere nearby. The sound grew steadily louder and more insistent, and then became clearer, the sound of frantic footsteps, the sound of something running toward them. Her heart pounded in her chest. Was it an animal or something else? She felt a surge of adrenaline, her senses sharpening. She knew with a terrible certainty that they were not alone. The group stood their ground. Closer now, she tried to stay calm, and then suddenly from out of the gloom, a pair of eyes emerged. They belonged to a panicked woman.
Chapter 6. White Silence. The wind clawed at Mireille's exposed cheeks, each gust a frigid slap that stole her breath. Snow, no longer falling so much as thrown, plastered itself to her glasses, blurring the already indistinct world into a canvas of white. She risked a glance back. Solange, a hunched, defiant silhouette against the swirling chaos, clung to Bastien's arm. He, in turn, leaned into Jean-Luc's back, a human chain struggling against the storm's relentless assault. The municipal depot, Jean-Luc had assured them, wasn't far, but in this whiteout, distances became deceptive, landmarks swallowed whole. Every step was a victory hard won. "Almost there!" Jean-Luc shouted, his voice rasped by the wind in the effort. Mireille wanted to believe him, needed to believe him. Her legs burned, and the cold had begun to seep into her bones, a deeper, more insidious chill than she had ever known. The wind howled in her ears, a banshee's cry that threatened to overwhelm her resolve. Bastien stumbled, a muffled curse escaping his lips. "I can't see shit," he yelled, wiping at his eyes with a snow-caked glove. "How much further, old man?" Solange gasped, clutching at his arm. "Show some respect." Jean-Luc, unfazed by the outburst, pointed into the swirling white. "There, the fence. Stay close." A chain-link fence, barely visible through the driving snow, emerged from the white abyss. It offered little shelter, but it was a marker, a promise of something more. They followed its jagged line, their hands scraping against the ice-coated metal, until a dark shape loomed ahead, the depot's gate. The gate was locked, a heavy padlock glinting mockingly in the gloom. Mireille's heart sank. All this struggle, only to be stopped by a simple lock. "Back," Bastien said, his voice tight with contained energy. He planted his feet, ignoring Solange's frail attempts to dissuade him, took a step back and drove his shoulder into the gate. The chain link rattled, but the lock held. He tried again, grunting with the effort. Still, the lock remained. Jean-Luc stepped forward, his gaunt face impassive. He pulled a ring of keys from his pocket, selected one, and calmly unlocked the gate. Bastien stared at him, his mouth slightly open. I thought," Bastien stammered. "I work here," Jean-Luc said, his voice flat. "Why wouldn't I have a key?" He pushed the gate open, revealing a vast snow-covered yard. The depot loomed at the far end, a dark, hulking presence against the storm-racked sky. The wind, momentarily blocked by the building, dropped to a manageable roar. The relief was short-lived. The outer doors were unlocked, seemingly left ajar against the elements. A bitter, biting cold permeated the air within the depot's garage. The darkness, amplified by the lack of power, pressed in on them, a heavy, suffocating blanket. The usual comforting noises of rumbling engines and shouted orders were absent, replaced by an unsettling silence, punctuated only by the howling wind. Mireille fumbled for her lighter, her fingers clumsy with cold.
A tiny flame flickered to life, casting long, dancing shadows on the concrete floor. She held it high, illuminating their faces, their breath misting in the frigid air. "Jean-Luc," Mireille asked, "is there any chance of getting the power back on?" He shook his head. "Emergency generator, but it needs someone to start it manually. It's in the basement." "And," Mireille prompted, seeing the hesitation in his eyes, "the basement, it floods, sometimes." He glanced down, then up again. "I know where the supply closet is first. Something for light, for warmth." "Let's go then," Mireille said, steeling herself. The initial relief of reaching shelter had evaporated, replaced by a new, more insidious dread. They were out of the storm, but they weren't safe. Not yet. The depot, meant to be a sanctuary, was just another battlefield in their fight for survival. They followed Jean-Luc into the cavernous garage.
The deeper they went, the colder it became. The only light came from Mireille's flickering lighter, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the parked snowplows and sanitation trucks. The air smelled of diesel and disinfectant, a sterile, metallic scent that did little to ease the growing unease. Here, Jean-Luc stopped before a set of battered metal lockers. He ran his hand along the row, pausing at one. This one is usually unlocked. He pulled at the handle. The locker remained shut. Bastien cracked his knuckles. "Step aside, Grandpa." "Wait," Jean-Luc said. Bastien ignored him. He kicked at the locker door just below the handle. The rusted metal gave way with a groan. He ripped open the door and grabbed whatever was within reach, a stack of wool blankets and a box of road flares. "Not bad," Bastien said, distributing the blankets. Mireille took one, wrapping it tightly around herself. The coarse wool offered a small measure of warmth, a temporary shield against the encroaching cold. "Flares won't last forever," Solange croaked, though she gratefully wrapped her small frame with a blanket as well. Jean-Luc nodded, already moving further into the building, towards a back stairwell, his face set with grim resolve. "Then we find something that will." The stairwell was even colder than the garage, a narrow, concrete chute that amplified the wind's mournful howl. Jean-Luc descended slowly, his hand trailing along the damp wall. Mireille followed, the lighter held high, casting dancing shadows that made the descent feel like a journey into the abyss. Bastien and Solange brought up the rear, their footfalls echoing eerily in the confined space. "Where are we going?" Bastien asked, his voice echoing up the stairwell. "To the office," Jean-Luc replied without breaking stride. "There's a radio there. Maybe we can get a signal, call for help." The office was a small, cramped room at the end of a narrow corridor. A single, grimy window offered a pale, snow-dusted view of the depot yard. The room was filled with outdated equipment, a clunky desktop computer, a rotary phone, and a large metal filing cabinet. Dust motes danced in the beam of Mireille's lighter, illuminating the room in a ghostly glow. Jean-Luc went straight to the radio, a bulky, old-fashioned model. He flipped a switch, and static crackled from the speaker. He adjusted the dial, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Anything?" Mireille asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jean-Luc shook his head. "Just static. The storm must be interfering with the signal." He tried again, his movements becoming more frantic. Still nothing but static. He slammed his fist on the radio, the sound echoing in the small room. "Damn it." Solange, huddled in a corner, shivered. "What now?" she asked, her voice laced with despair. Bastien leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "Now we wait. What else can we do?" Mireille looked from Jean-Luc's frustrated face to Solange's shivered in form, and then to Bastien, whose bravado seemed to be wavering. The storm raged outside, and they were trapped, cold and alone. It was time to take charge. "Jean-Luc, show me where this generator is," she said, her voice firm. "Bastien, see if you can find any fuel for it. Solange, you stay here, out of the wind." She handed Solange the lighter. "Conserve the fuel." Jean-Luc looked at her, surprised. "You? You don't know anything about generators." "Maybe not," Mireille replied, "but I know that we can't just sit here and wait to freeze, and right now getting that generator running is the best chance we've got." Jean-Luc hesitated, then nodded slowly. "All right, follow me. But be careful. Those basement stairs are treacherous, even without the water." He grabbed a road flare from Bastien and lit it, the sudden burst of orange light banishing the shadows, if only for a short while. "Stay close," he repeated, turning toward the door. Chapter 7. A Kind of Warmth. Solange's breath hitched, a wet, rattling sound that cut through the depot's hollow silence. Mireille, kneeling beside her on the grimy concrete floor, felt the older woman's hand, bone cold even through the blanket Bastien had scavenged. The breath hitched again, shallower this time. "She's not doing good," Bastien said, his voice rough, all bravado gone. He cracked his knuckles, the sound sharp and brittle in the cold.
Mireille pressed her fingers to Solange's wrist, searching for a pulse. It was thready, erratic. She's going into shock. The cold, it's too much. Jean-Luc emerged from the shadows, a small, battered first aid kit in his hand. He knelt, offering it to Mireille without a word. His movements were economical, devoid of wasted motion, his gaze steady. He'd known where to look. Bastien hovered, useless. What do? We gotta do something. Mireille rifled through the kit. Aspirin, bandages, antiseptic wipes, a couple of disposable blankets. Nothing that would truly help. Bastien, can you find something to elevate her feet? Anything. A box, a pile of rags. She needed to get blood flowing back to Solange's core. Bastien scrambled away, disappearing into the maze of parked sanitation vehicles. Mireille pulled a thin, metallic blanket from the kit and spread it over Solange. Solange, can you hear me? She asked, her voice firm but gentle. Squeeze my hand if you can hear me. Solange's fingers twitched weakly. Mireille took her hand, holding it firmly. Good. Just stay with us, Solange. Stay with me. Jean-Luc watched, his face unreadable. He had seen this before, Mireille realized. This close dance with death, the fragile thread of life threatening to snap. He understood the grim calculus of survival. Bastien returned, dragging a heavy cardboard box. He positioned it under Solange's feet, his movements frantic. Will this work? Is this enough? Mireille nodded, trying to ignore the gnawing fear in her own chest. It will help. Jean-Luc, is there any way to rig up some kind of windbreak, keep her out of the draft? He gestured towards a stack of salvaged tarpaulins. Enough to block the wind. While Jean-Luc secured the makeshift barrier, Mireille focused on Solange. The rattling in her chest had worsened. Solange, are you having trouble breathing? Is your chest tight? Solange's eyes fluttered open, glazed with fever. She nodded, a barely perceptible movement. Bastien swore under his breath. Damn it all. He knew how to deal with a knife fight, a bar brawl. This frail, fading woman was beyond his comprehension. Jean-Luc came back, the tarpaulin secured. He watched Solange, his expression still inscrutable, but his jaw tight. He had likely seen factory workers injured. He likely knew the signs of a body failing. Mireille spotted a small, blue plastic inhaler in the kit. She hesitated. It wasn't a solution, but it might alleviate some of the immediate distress. Solange, I'm going to give you a puff of this. It will help you breathe easier. She demonstrated, pressing the inhaler to Solange's lips and timing the release with her shallow breaths. In, out. Good. The rattling seemed to subside slightly. Solange's breathing remained shallow, but less labored. Think you can get her to drink something? Bastien asked. Mireille shook her head. Not yet. She needs to stabilize first. She continued to hold Solange's hand, focusing all her energy on keeping the older woman present. Solange, she said, her voice low and steady. Tell me something. Tell me about the bakery you used to work at. It was a shot in the dark, something to anchor her, to pull her back from the brink. Distraction wasn't her training. She had to force herself to engage. Solange did have a faint, sweet smell like baked goods. Solange's eyes flickered, focusing on Mireille's face. Her lips moved, forming a dry, cracked smile. The smell, she whispered.
The smell of warm bread. Yes, Mireille pressed. The smell of warm bread. Tell me more. She was trying to keep Solange conscious from drifting away into the numbing cold. Tell me about the baker. What was his name? Monsieur Dubois, Solange said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. He made the best croissants. Flaky, buttery. Bastien watched, his initial frustration giving way to a grudging respect. He would have yelled, threatened. Mireille was doing something different. Jean-Luc shifted, the scrape of his boots against the concrete the only sound. He said nothing, but his presence was a steady anchor. His silence, Mireille realized, wasn't indifference. It was a watchful, pragmatic acceptance of what was and what might be. They huddled together, a small island of warmth in the vast, cold depot. Solange's shallow breaths, Mireille's steady voice coaxing memories, Bastien's restless energy contained, and Jean-Luc's quiet watchfulness, a strange, fractured cohesion, born not of affection, but of desperate necessity.
Earlier, Bastien had spoken about violence and acted to protect his mother. The coin's origins and Solange's experience were also vocalized. Stories, now the only bulwark against the encroaching cold and the fear that gnawed at their edges. Hours passed, marked only by the gradual deepening of the shadows and the chilling realization that the depot remained stubbornly dark and silent. Jean-Luc hadn't returned from the basement. The generator taunted them with its absence. Mireille's hand ached from holding Solange's, but she didn't dare let go. Suddenly, a new sound, a low groan that echoed through the depot. It wasn't Solange. Bastien stiffened, his head cocked, listening. What the hell was that?
Chapter 8. Echoes. The groan vibrated through the concrete floor, a low, guttural rumble that seemed to emanate from the depot's very foundations. It wasn't the building settling, it was something else, something heavy and mechanical struggling to life. Jean-Luc paused, halfway to the stairwell, his hand tightened on the wrench. He glanced back at Mireille, her face etched with a fresh wave of concern. Solange, propped against a stack of salvaged blankets, flinched. Even Bastien, who had been methodically cleaning a found cigarette lighter, stilled his hands. The sound came again, louder this time, laced with the unmistakable whine of an engine turning over. "What the hell is that?" Bastien muttered, his eyes darting towards the reinforced garage doors. Mireille shook her head. "I don't know. Jean-Luc, any ideas?" He hesitated, then spoke, his voice barely audible above the groaning. "Could be the snowplows, clearing the roads." Hope flickered in Mireille's eyes. "Snowplows? Already?" "Maybe," Jean-Luc said. "Or maybe it's the backup generator," Bastien suggested. "The one they use for emergencies." Jean-Luc's silence confirmed it. The depot did have an emergency generator, a massive diesel-powered beast located in the basement, the same basement prone to flooding. He hadn't considered it, focused solely on the smaller unit to power essential lights. Bastien stood. "Well, whatever it is, it's getting closer, and loud. Should we check it out?" Mireille nodded, relief battling with apprehension on her face. "Jean-Luc, you know this place. What do you think?" He weighed the options. Snowplows meant rescue, but also potential danger on the roads if they tried to leave too soon. The generator meant warmth and light, but the basement was a risk. "I'll check," he said, his voice firm. "Bastien, with me. Mireille, stay with Solange. Keep her warm." Bastien grinned, a flash of something almost like eagerness in his eyes. "Let's do it." Jean-Luc grabbed a heavy flashlight from a nearby shelf. Its beam cut through the gloom as they headed towards the sound, away from the stairwell, towards the front of the depot and the vast garage doors. The groaning intensified with each step, vibrating through the steel of the building. They reached the doors. Jean-Luc risked a quick glance through a grimy window. The world outside was a swirling white void. Then a flicker of yellow. A massive snowplow, its blade piled high with snow, was struggling to turn in the depot's yard, its engine roaring. Another plow idled behind it, its headlights fighting through the blizzard's fading fury. "Snowplows," he said, turning back to Mireille. "They're here." Mireille sagged against a stack of crates, relief flooding her face. Thank God! But the relief was short-lived. The depot doors remained shut. The plows outside were focused on clearing the main roads, not rescuing those trapped inside. Jean-Luc knew they couldn't simply wait. Solange needed proper medical attention, and the depot was still freezing. "We need to signal them," Mireille said, her voice regaining its edge of determination. "Get their attention." Bastien, ever resourceful, grabbed a handful of the flares he'd found earlier. "I'll set these off outside," he said. "That should do the trick." Jean-Luc shook her head. "Too dangerous. You won't be able to see anything in this. You'll get lost." He looked up, his gaze fixed on a high window overlooking the yard. "We need to get up there. Something bright. Something they can't miss." He knew exactly what he needed. The safety reflector, a massive, intensely reflective sheet used to warn drivers of hazards during sanitation work. It was stored in a locker near the depot's administrative offices on the second floor. Getting there meant navigating the maze of the depot, but it was their best chance. "Bastien, with me," Jean-Luc said, heading back towards the stairwell he'd initially abandoned. This time he moved with a renewed sense of purpose.
"Mireille, stay with Solange. Keep her as warm as possible. We'll be back." As they climbed the stairs, the snowplows continued their work outside, their groaning engines a soundtrack to the quiet determination settling over the depot. They were saved, maybe, but they weren't safe yet. Reaching the administrative offices, the cold was more intense, seeping through the closed doors and windows. The power outage had rendered the electronic locks useless, which meant the depot hadn't been robbed by the desperate already. "Think you can get this open?" Jean-Luc asked, gesturing to a locker with a heavy-duty padlock. Bastien grinned, pulling a Slim Jim from his pocket. "Watch and learn." Within seconds, the lock clicked open. Inside, among stacks of paperwork and outdated safety manuals, was the reflector. Jean-Luc grabbed it, the cold metal biting into his gloved hands. As he pulled it free, a small framed photograph fell to the floor, landing face up. He picked it up. It was a picture of a younger Jean-Luc, smiling, standing beside a woman and a little girl in front of a small house. The woman's arm was around his waist, her smile radiant. The little girl held a brightly colored toy truck. A pang of something akin to pain shot through him. He hadn't seen this picture in years. He hadn't allowed himself to. Bastien coughed, breaking the silence. "Everything okay?" Jean-Luc stared at the photograph for a moment longer, then tucked it into his coat pocket. He didn't say a word. He just turned and headed back towards the stairs, the reflector clutched tightly in his hand. They had a signal to make, a rescue to secure, and a past he couldn't outrun, no matter how hard he tried. They hurried back to the others, the reflector awkward in Jean-Luc's grip. As they descended, the depot seemed to sigh around them, the groaning of the snowplows outside softening into a steady hum. They reached the main hall to find Mireille tending to Solange, wrapping her in every blanket they could find. The girl's breathing was shallow, her face pale. "How is she?" Jean-Luc asked, his voice low. Mireille looked up, her eyes tired but hopeful. "Holding on, but we need to get her to a hospital." They moved towards the loading bay door, and, surprisingly, the great door shuddered and slowly began to open. Blinding light flooded the depot as one of the snowplows had finished clearing the doors and the driver was dismounting. Jean-Luc unfurled the reflector, its bright orange surface reflecting the morning light back at an almost painful intensity. He angled it towards the plow, waving it frantically. The driver, a burly man in a snow-covered parka, shielded his eyes, then waved back. "They see us," Bastien shouted, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. The rescue had arrived, but as Jean-Luc looked around at the small group huddled together in the doorway, he saw something more than just relief. He saw the bond that had formed in the crucible of their shared experience. Mireille's face was softer, her gaze filled with a quiet understanding. Bastien, the perpetual troublemaker, stood straighter, his eyes reflecting a newfound sense of purpose. Even Solange, despite her weakened state, managed a small, grateful smile. They didn't speak. There were no grand pronouncements of friendship or promises of a brighter future, just a silent acknowledgement of what they had endured and how it had changed them. Perhaps for the better, perhaps not. It was too soon to tell. As the rescue workers approached, Jean-Luc placed a hand on Mireille's shoulder, a gesture of comfort and solidarity. He knew they would never forget this place, or each other. The depot, with its echoes of the past and the ghosts of what might have been, had bound them together in a way they could never have anticipated. As they stepped out into the blinding light of the cleared road, leaving the depot behind, they knew they were heading back into a world forever altered.
The blizzard was over, but the storm within each of them was just beginning.